Slideshow.
I didn't start yet.
Okay.
Okay. The newspaper industry today is in decline. This is an incontrovertible fact. And it's very surprising considering that just 100 years ago, people thought, well, newspapers had a monopoly on the media industry as a whole. However, there are many factors in the intervening 100 years that changed that reality. 100 years ago, pretty much all of your news came either through newspapers or through magazines, but primarily newspapers. But the first instance where another form of media began to cut into that was the introduction of radio, then television afterwards. The reason they cut into the newspaper market share is because they were quicker and a more versatile way of obtaining news or entertainment or any other thing. And however, these things didn't really affect the newspaper industry as a whole. They did affect it, but not as significantly as huge events would. That came to form the internet in the 1990s. And the internet completely changed the reality of what was going on because it allowed for people to communicate instantaneously, not only with anyone, but anywhere. So what that did was really make newspapers obsolete in a way. So from that point onwards, the newspaper share of the media industry has been steadily declining. And the newspaper industry today is perhaps on the verge of collapse, in a severe decline, and people aren't sure what's coming next, both for newspapers and for journalism as a whole. Alright, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about specifics of how exactly newspapers were affected, starting with the radio and TV. Radios first became popular during the Great Depression era because they were a lot more affordable than a newspaper subscription was at that time. During this time, the radio advertising revenue doubled, whereas the subscriptions of newspapers overall fell by 50%, according to the ThinkWest online encyclopedia. So with the significant cut into their advertising revenues, which is the primary source of income for most, if not all, newspapers, marked the beginning of a slow but steady slide for the newspapers. This was exacerbated more by the introduction of television, because television did the same thing radio did, except on a much broader scale. And as television added more channels and more specialty niches that cut into many of the markets that newspapers previously enjoyed to themselves, it really took a hit on the newspaper industry as a whole. This came primarily in the form of the loss of evening newspapers, which were the most common form of newspapers about 100 years ago. However, they peaked during the late 60s, early 70s, with about 37 million subscriptions and 1,500 evening newspapers across America, according to the Newspaper Association of America. And the rise of TV and its eventual diversification into specialties like CNN and other 24/7 hour news channels really had an adverse effect on evening newspapers. And today they're pretty much extinct because of that. And newspapers as a whole, both daily and evening, morning and evening, also enjoyed the high point around the same time that evening newspapers did in the early 1970s. And since then, the number of subscriptions overall has continuously declined. And this is happening now at a much faster rate because of the introduction of the internet. So the internet has really affected the newspaper industry in two ways. A, through decreased circulation, and B, through a loss of advertising revenue. And what this has done is cut into the bottom line of many publishing companies and force them to undergo many measures to cut costs and try to balance out what they've lost to the internet. So, looking at each point specifically, in terms of circulation, as you can see from this graph from the Pew Research Center, newspaper circulation has been steadily declining over the past 20 years, but as news has become more popularized in the last perhaps 10 years or so, and there's been a large shift to more digital media and more digital news content in general, that's resulted in a much steeper loss of circulation. And this can also be seen in circulation revenue. Even accounting for inflation, you can see in recent years that the revenues the newspaper industry has obtained from circulations and subscriptions has declined precipitously. And in terms of advertising revenue, as you can see from this graph, the red bars here indicate the amount of money obtained from print media, print advertising revenue, whereas the yellow accounts for online advertising revenue. And although many newspaper companies today have shifted to a lot more online content, the amount of revenue they obtain from that is relatively insignificant. And overall advertising revenue has fallen by about 50% over the last 5 years. And it's become much harder for newspapers to obtain advertising revenue because if you go more and more online, you have to you encounter niche websites like Google Ads and Craigslist, and it's hard to compete with them in terms of recruiting advertisers. So what a lot of newspapers are trying to do now, which is an interesting development to monitor in the future, is the effect of online paywalls that force you to pay for your online content. And what this all adds up to is a loss in the bottom line of many newspapers. Although they still make a good profit, it's significantly lower than what they did even about 10 years ago. The profit margins declined by about 50%. So this is, since many investors feel like they're not maximizing their investment in newspapers, that's why a lot of newspaper stock and other things have declined significantly. For example, the publishing company Knight Ridder, the publishing company Knight Ridder, for example, was operating at a 20% operating margin in 2006, and their investors felt this wasn't significant enough, so they sold it to another publishing company, McClatchy Newspapers. And in the same year, McClatchy Newspapers had a stock of about $75 per share, whereas today it's declined to $3 per share. So stock prices have fallen off steeply from the newspapers as well. They've taken a very hard hit, especially during the recent recession. What newspapers are doing to make up for that is trying to cut costs. They're eliminating their foreign bureaus. They're printing on fewer days, like the New Orleans Times-Picayune has cut half the newsroom and moved to only printing 3 days a week, and significant layoffs, all of which is a negative for the newspaper industry. And I guess what this means for journalism is that it's become a lot harder for news writers in general to find a living, especially writing online, because they're facing so much more competition from other writers who write about the same things. So one of the effects it's having is that people feel that this is leading to deteriorating standards of journalism, where people are sacrificing the quality of writing for page views and other things that get them attention, hits, which leads to more money for them. So this is also an interesting development to monitor in the future, including the rise of websites that cater to amateur writers like the Huffington Post and the Bleacher Report. So overall, looking towards the next 5 years, this will mark a pivotal time for the future of newspapers. They'll either remain the bastion of the media, the cornerstone that they have been for the past few centuries, or they'll wither away into oblivion. So what's interesting to monitor is how they're going to respond to this, how they can transition online effectively, or if they can stay in print overall. An interesting question to ask is, where will newspapers be in 5 years? And this is something we should all monitor going forward. Thank you.